attention, BART riders.
Hey, San Francisco, I'm Ben Kaplan, and this is the podcast where we define who we are and who we want to be.
We are diverse.
We are innovative.
We are inclusive.
We are change makers.
Problem solvers.
Activists.
Leaders.
Citizens.
We are open-minded.
Optimistic.
There's hope for a better tomorrow. And you gotta give them hope.
This is the podcast that's more than a podcast.
San Francisco, they are the world champion.
We are San Francisco. Hey, San Francisco. Today I'm chatting with Rachael Tanner. She currently serves as president of the San Francisco Planning Commission. That's the body that advises city leaders on San Francisco's long-range goals, policies, and programs related to land use, housing, transportation, and more. The commission also holds weekly public hearings, maintains the San Francisco General Plan, we'll talk more about that in a minute, and approves all permits and licenses subject to the planning code. Rachael's had a long career in planning, including in San Francisco, Palo Alto, and Long Beach, and she has a unique perspective on the role of planning in a city's future. So does San Francisco have the right plan in place, or any plan in place, to turn things around? Let's find out with Rachael Tanner. Rachael, one of the first things that we should talk about is what specifically is the role of the San Francisco Planning Commission? What is it, but also what is it not? Because sometimes people have a misconception about both the commission and also someone like yourself who serves on the commission as president, what your role actually is.
Yeah, it's a great question, a great place to start. The Planning Commission is a body that is responsible for oversight of the San Francisco Planning Department, which is a department that is staffed by, civil servants, folks who are serving the city, many of them planners, but also other roles as well, doing the work of the people. And so we are that oversight body. There are 7 of us. 4 of us are nominated by the mayor and need to be confirmed by the Board of Supervisors, and 3 are nominated by the Board of Supervisors and also need to be confirmed by a majority of the Board of Supervisor members. So 7 folks overall charged with that. And what does the planning department do? Well, the planning department and thus the commission is really responsible for the administration of the San Francisco Planning Code. So that's laws and ordinances, maps, and other legal kind of elements that say, for more or less, to summarize, like what can you build where and what can you do where and what kind of business can you operate where, what can your house or building or other kind of activity look like and where can it occur in the city? So a plan for how to use the land of the city and what uses are appropriate.
One of the things that we've chatted about previously is that sometimes people think, for instance, that being president of the SF Planning Commission is a full-time job. It's actually not a full-time job, even though you've had a long history in planning, whether that's with the city and county of San Francisco, of course, but also the city of Palo Alto. You have other work that you do as well. So what is the other misconceptions you get about your specific role that are like that so people can understand how the commission functions?
Yeah. I think it's important to know that whether you're, in San Francisco, you're obviously listening because you're interested in San Francisco, but maybe you lived in another city or lived in another city. Most cities have a planning commission or some type of land use body that's very similar. I don't think there's hardly any that are full-time. So everybody who's serving is serving as a volunteer. We're not elected. We're appointed by elected officials, but we're not elected ourselves. And so that's important to know. And we're all doing this in our free time, in our extra time. The Planning Commission for San Francisco is a pretty hefty volunteering because we meet every week, every Thursday, with a few exceptions for some holidays and a couple times a year. But it's, kind of pretty intense in that regard. So that's, I think, a misconception is like, it's not a full-time job. It's a volunteer job. And well, I think just, we're all 7 individuals. So even here today, I'm the president, which is great, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot. It means that I get to have an officers meeting with the vice president every other week to kind of look ahead at the agenda. I can maybe make some suggestions around ordering things or calendaring different items during the hearing itself. I'm kind of presiding over the hearing. So who gets to talk? How long do you get to talk? Do people get extra time? Some of the actual procedures of the unfolding of the meeting. But I don't get an extra vote, still 1 of 7 votes. And so while certainly an important role that I'm really honored to have, I wouldn't say that I have, more authority for very many things than any other planning commissioner has. And even today, while I'm speaking to you all, I'm not speaking as the president, I'm speaking as Rachael Tanner and speaking on my own behalf and sharing my views. because I haven't been authorized by the commission to speak on behalf of the commission or on behalf of the department.
So we have a little bit of our San Francisco Planning Commission 101. Now I want to actually talk about some of the other kind of guiding documents related to the Planning Commission and related to the future of San Francisco that not a lot of people know exists. For instance, when I talk to whether it's elected officials, appointed officials, people who work in government, as well as general residents or citizens, the general consensus now is, San Francisco, we've got to change our trajectory. We're not headed in the right direction now. And then that begs the question, what is the right trajectory? There's policy positions on different issues, which are very challenging, but do we have a plan? Does a plan exist? And there actually is something called the San Francisco General Plan that I want to start with. The background of this plan is that it was, first adopted by the Planning Commission in 1945, and it has a set of objectives and goals. But what's interesting about it, and you can take us through this, is that there's parts that are updated more frequently and other parts that, maybe haven't been updated in decades. So what is this general plan for San Francisco? What is it supposed to be about the direction of our future? Because lots of people want to know, what's our future coming up? And they don't realize that there actually is a document. Whether or not that reflects reality, we can discuss that.
Yeah. So certainly general plans, and as I said, kind of general plans have different elements. So you have the general plan, and then you might have the housing element, the safety element, environmental protection, recreation and open space, transportation. Some of those names you can kind of imagine what topics they're around, right? And what they may contain. And the idea, and maybe a good analogy I've heard and I think is appropriate, that, the general plan is kind of like the city's constitution. Technically our constitution would be the charter, but in the sense that it's like a guiding document that lays out kind of ideals, policy positions, directionality of the city. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And then you would have our actual ordinances, the San Francisco Municipal Code, that actually says, here are the laws and how we want to achieve those policies, how we want those values to be kind of lived out in the day-to-day. So kind of the general plan is either, maybe you can think about it as kind of foundational direction setting document that's kind of guiding the growth, development and changes of the city on a range of topics that they cover.
Well, and it seems like it's grown over time, right? In terms of the topics, right? Because it sort of has this notion of, as part of the Planning Commission, it's the development of actual land in the city. What's its use going to be? Of course, underpins all of this. But if I'm just, glancing at it now, and I have things in the general plan for air quality and arts and community facilities and urban design and environmental protection, those aren't necessarily things that have always been there, but it seems like the scope of that plan has expanded, but different parts of it sort of get different amounts of attention or updates, and even sometimes updates by law in the case of the recently updated housing element.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I think one thing that is interesting about the general plan is that it really isn't just for the planning department, just for land use. It is the general plan for the entire city. And so when you think about some of these, even the housing element, we'll stick with that. There are many items in the housing element that are not necessarily about land use. For example, we have goals around how do we increase home ownership? How do we increase home ownership among people of color? Which certainly a house is a land use, but it's really programmatic, right? The way we're going to get to that goal is by having programs that in those cases, the mayor's office of housing and community development, they're likely going to be the ones who are running or operating a program around home ownership, for example. Or it could be even touching with the Public Utilities Commission. If we want to have an environmental element, we want to go green, we want to use less greenhouse gas emissions. Well, there's a land use element to pretty much anything, but it may be the PUC in some cases that might be the leader on helping us to go green in some ways that we're using energy and how we're using our natural resources. So it really is a general plan for the whole city. And so many of those elements may call upon different departments to be the lead in carrying out and fulfilling different policies, goals, objectives.
And do you think that we ought to use it more as a guiding document? My feeling is that we're in a situation now that is a very challenging situation, right? There's multiple crises affecting San Francisco, whether you want to call that the fentanyl crisis or the homelessness crisis or crime and safety overall. Those are big, challenging problems. And what I wonder about is if we sort of need this guiding direction. We do need a plan. And a plan is more than, most of those are crises, probably because I think most people would agree that There's many facets to these kind of problems, right? It's not like you do one thing and it's solved. Like, okay, here's the one thing we do and fentanyl crisis is solved. No, it's because there's many issues that relate to actual drug abuse. It could relate to mental health. It could relate to homelessness. It could relate to crime and safety that all have to work. And the issue is that way city governments are divided, and you got more than 70 city departments, is that many have to come together for all parts of that to kind of solution. So you kind of do need a guiding document, and it makes total sense that we would have a plan. But does that plan reflect reality? Because if it was set like, okay, this is our overall goal that was set, 10 or 20 years ago, and it hasn't been updated, but like we've got people with the kind of drug addiction that we haven't ever seen before, and it needs action now. Should we be updating these more frequently? Do we need a more like San Francisco 2023 plan?
I would say, in my experience as a planner, the general plan is not the best tool to deal with something acute. And so I think, my analysis of kind of where we are in San Francisco, I can get into that, but kind of what do we do about it? I think we need acute, kind of very focused and targeted planning that's very short term, 1 to 3 year time frame. Whereas general plans are intentionally kind of setting out at least a decade or even more, right, in their outset of like what the time horizon is. And just practically speaking, updating an element of the general plan in San Francisco, whether good, bad, or otherwise, is a several year project. So we need to be getting things together that are very quick and very responsive, not beginning a planning process that historically, wouldn't even be finished until like 2 to 3 years from now. That's far too long.
So even our planning process is slow. Why is it so slow? Why does it take 2 to 3 years? Just because there's like lots of voices that have to be agreed, or why does it take that long?
It's a couple of things. I think part because it's a long-term document. If you're thinking, okay, this is going to be a 10 or 20-year document, and as you noted, some of our elements have been around for more decades than that. But even if you're saying it's going to be a 10-year document, the idea of taking 2 to 3 years to plan that doesn't sound so crazy. And we do have a city that has a strong history of lots of engagement, lots of involvement, making sure we have all the voices in the room. And we also have a history of not always agreeing on things. And so things can get sidelined, things can get extended, things can take, more time, which in some ways is the purpose and the way the democratic process is supposed to function, right? That people can raise their hands and say, hey, it's not good enough. We need more of this, we need more of that. And that our elected leaders and appointed leaders even too would be responsive, right, to the needs of people. We can also talk about the fact that there can be the opposite side of that in democratic process. It can be kind of last person standing, right? So the person with the most time, the most resources to kind of keep saying, this is not good enough, I want my way. Other folks can get tired and go home, right? And have to go do other things with their lives and may not be able to be that last voice standing. And that's where I think we are a disservice to the general public when instead of listening to what most people want and what's going to do the most good or helping maybe populations that get overlooked, sometimes it can be a battle of, who can outlast each other in a screaming match.
Okay.
And the person who lasts the longest, they get to win.
What you're saying is that, hey, when you have a plan that is a long-term plan, that makes sense that it takes a long term. It takes a while to get it because you're trying to get it set. But then we're in sort of this moment now where there are acute crises. There are things that, we can't wait 10 years to like address fentanyl, right? We have to do something. So what exists in its place now? Is it largely the budget, in your opinion, being used as that? Because the budget kind of reflects changing priorities, and you've got to, the mayor has to submit it every year and the board of supervisors has to approve it. And that's our plan by default, basically follow where the money goes and you'll see our priorities. Is that what you think? Or is there something else, or ought we to have something else?
So I think there are several different plans underway that kind of live and are kind of kept by different parts of the city, whether it's like the city formally as government or different even maybe private or public sector actors that are throughout the city. So the first that I would direct folks to, if you're really interested, is the roadmap to downtown San Francisco's future. And that is being spearheaded by Mayor Breed. And from that, I think it's a really easy to read website and set of documents. It's not, like our general plan documents are hundreds of pages. The downtown roadmap to downtown's future is much more accessible and really just talks about a set of strategies to achieve and help recover downtown. And why is downtown so important? You may have talked about this in other episodes. Like, it is an economic engine. So not only does it help to fund our tax base, which helps to fund city services. It's where a lot of tourists go, and tourism is huge for local businesses, for arts, entertainment, et cetera. Like they get a lot of their income and their resources that then become tax dollars from people patronizing hotels and conferences and going out to eat and all these other things. And so having a really strong downtown, really vibrant downtown is really, really important, not just to downtown itself, but important to the whole city if you live in San Francisco. So yeah, that's a great example of like a very put together in an expedited manner because of the acute problems that we have with downtown after kind of this kind of remote work, hybrid work environment. And I think that's the kind of planning that we need to do.
Hi, I'm Ben Kaplan, a passionate advocate for City College of San Francisco, and I'm running for the Board of Trustees. Our college is key to solving our city's toughest challenges, from creating essential worker pipelines to achieving financial security and reigniting enrollments. But we need your help. Donate now to support free tuition and transform City College into a model of educational opportunity. Join us in making a difference. Visit votebenkaplan.com to find out more. Now back to the show. As someone who's worked in city government, whether in San Francisco or otherwise for a long time, what is your feeling of the area plan specifically? Like if people go now and if you go to the general plan, and there's a section on it that has area plans, and you'll see there's plans from everywhere from a civic center area to Mission to Bayview, Hunters Point to sub areas like Candlestick and others that may have changed. How do we work in neighborhoods and very specific concerns? Because you can have the same issue that has a very different approach to neighborhoods, right? Like if you talk about drug crisis, fentanyl crisis in the Tenderloin, it's going to feel different than maybe some of the outer neighborhoods. So to what extent do we need this is our master plan for the city on this issue? And to what extent do we need really neighborhood specific thinking, because it may be totally different in a certain neighborhood, just what the concerns are?
Yeah. It's good to think about kind of, how do we help the fentanyl crisis in general, right? Across the city, there may be programs that help, people in a variety of neighborhoods, right? It's not really based on your location. It's based on what you need. But that, in certain neighborhoods, the way that crisis shows up, the way it manifests itself might call for a set of actions to take place there and a set of strategies that you don't necessarily need to deploy in the entire city. So I just want to make that distinction. And I would say my favorite planning answer, it depends. It depends what crisis we're talking about, and it depends on kind of how we're planning for it. Just to use the housing element as another example, again, an extension of the general plan, which we just adopted January of this year, 2023, by the Board of Supervisors and signed by the mayor. That is a plan that lays out things for the city, how we're going to accommodate 82,000 housing units in the city. And what we're getting ready to do now is a rezoning plan for essentially the western portion of the city to change the zoning for that area. And so it won't necessarily affect the entire city, but it will be some plans specifically around how the zoning is going to change there. And again, for those, what is zoning? Zoning is what you can do, where can you do it, how much can you do it for that part of the city.
Do you think we're at a disadvantage in San Francisco? Because I don't think most people would say we're lightning fast in getting things approved. Or another discussion, we've had it on the podcast before about discretionary review and this idea that even an individual person or organization for whatever reason can hold things up. But I think most people would say we're not a lightning fast city government in making progress. But the situation now, though, is that there's a lot of things changing. And that was changes that were brought about by COVID and pandemic, changes related to that changed about maybe the notion of work in an office or work from home. Certainly other crises like the rise of fentanyl, which made it something that was highly addictive and at the same time inexpensive, which is a really bad combination for a city. Those two things together. So we've got stuff changing. It would seem to favor those who can change fast, but that's technically not a strong suit of San Francisco, that it kind of puts us at a disadvantage, it seems like. Do you agree or disagree?
I would agree. I mean, I think the times we were in call for very swift action and kind of coalescing. But the one thing that I would say is, I don't want to say necessarily hopeful, but to show what's possible, the way that we rallied and were able to respond very quickly to COVID.
Absolutely, right? Lots of people came together in short order, and suddenly all this stuff had been 2 years of debate. We got done fast. Absolutely. So it's possible.
So if we could apply that same level of both like this is a crisis and we need all hands on deck and we've got to just like put aside differences and do what's best.
What's interesting though is from your seat on obviously the Planning Commission, but also just a long time in city government, aside from COVID, what would it take to bring people together like that? Because you see, it's not impossible in other cities. I mean, you see examples of like, if you look at what Houston's been able to do with homelessness, where a lot of different public and private groups came together and got aligned. You see some interesting examples in Rhode Island with homelessness and the drug crisis. Again, more alignment. So other places do it. And obviously a lot of good, smart, talented people in San Francisco. But somehow it's like we put all those good, smart, talented people in a certain environment with a certain canvas, and we don't produce the best result that we could get. So what would it take to get that kind of alignment, or is it just too polarizing? And it's even weird for me to say polarizing because it's polarizing. We're like 9 out of 10 people in the city are Democrats, right? It shouldn't be polarizing, yet it feels incredibly polarizing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple responses. Like if we think about like the big areas, like what would it take to come together? I don't think it's like one thing in one area. I think there are both structural changes. So we think about, for example, in our city, we kind of have a strong mayor, but also not really. Like, let's just use the example of my appointment. I'm getting nominated by the mayor, but then the Board of Supervisors has to approve me, which means like in the theory would be that there'd be a compromise, finding somebody that the Board of Supervisors likes and the mayor's likes. But at the end of the day, then, is it really the mayor who has gotten their persons on the planning commission to then make decisions? So if you look at the way that the mayor doesn't have certain powers, we don't have like somebody in our city where the buck stops. Like in some jobs, like in the mayor or like the president, you can say, if we get rid of the mayor, we get rid of the president, we get a new person in there, they're going to have the power to make changes. The mayor's power after Willie Brown was mayor, the Board of Supervisors and others curtailed the power of our mayor. And so the power is very diffuse in San Francisco. Even just look at the Planning Commission. There's 7 of us, 4 from the mayor, 3 from the Board of Supervisors. 4 of us have to align for any action to be taken. So like you have to have a lot of alignment amongst a lot of different folks in San Francisco structurally to move things forward. And then you have us kind of culturally where we fight over very, very small differences. And I think there are reasons where certain groups get funding, they are kind of like set up and they get their bread and butter by having a certain ideology and a certain perspective, and like maintaining that perspective is in their advantage versus coming to a compromise position where it's like, let's do what's best for everybody, or like, let's do what's the most good, even if it isn't exactly perfect. And there are a lot of folks who call into the Planning Commission who are part of certain decision-making tables where the perfect is the enemy of the good. And like good is not sufficient and they really want it to be perfect. I mean, it's people who say, oh, I like housing, but just not there. Oh, I like this housing, but there's not enough affordable. Well, I like this housing, but could it also? And it's like, we have to just say, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's better than zero. And so I think culturally and structurally, there have to be some significant changes to be able to cut through kind of this vitriol that can really ham us up from moving forward in ways that are not even just productive, but like ways that are necessary if we are going to stem the downward cycle that we're kind of currently on.
Well, and also sometimes the notion of compromise, or another way to put it, is just to like get everyone on board, right? Like we're on board this train together, all aboard, let's get on this train. But to actually implement things, you might need everyone on board, right? You can't be a train where your locomotive's going this way and your caboose is going this way and there's other cars going that way. And we need alignment, right, from all these stakeholders. So we kind of got everyone involved. One of the issues is you could take a good policy, a good law, and in that last mile of implementation, totally make it ineffective based on what costs are associated with it. How is it efficiently executed? What departments oversee it? And it's where you get maybe good intentions and you end up with people kind of like the headlines of a $61,000 toilet, right? Or like a $100,000 temporary housing or all of that, because maybe even it came from a sensible place, but in that last mile, right? That time to execution, then we just didn't quite look at it closely enough. And we didn't have everyone assigned to do that, wouldn't you say? And so that's why sometimes I feel like even like a brilliant law or position or plan, if it's overly complex and if it's not transparent enough for what actually happens, is almost doomed to fail. because we can't oversee it enough to make sure we get the result we want. So we get the opposite of the result we want, which is usually we spend a bunch of money on something that was totally ineffective. And we've got to figure out a way, I think, to simplify things because complex things are hard to implement, unfortunately.
I would agree with that. And I think part of sometimes, not all the time, sometimes what we get with such complexity, though, is the compromise process, right? If we're trying to have a program that pleases all the stakeholders, instead of maybe focusing on the results that we want, or to your point, maybe we don't have enough information in the policy design phase. So we have a great idea, but we don't know it costs $100,000. And you know what I mean? That would be good information when we say, well, it's a good idea, but it's not $100,000 good. You know what I mean? That the cost benefit there should help us to rethink the way we're structuring the policy. But again, hopeful sign. Prop H, which was passed by the voters a couple of years ago, unfortunately passed by the voters, could have been passed by the Board of Supervisors as a law, but unfortunately had to be taken to the voters to be voted on, again, because there was not alignment. There was not agreement amongst the leadership of our city. But it said, hey, city departments, you've got X number of days to process these applications for small businesses. And lo and behold, we figured out how to do it, and we are doing it. Day in and day out, we are meeting those deadlines. So again, when we have clear deadlines, to your point, that are simple and actionable, like we can make progress, we can do this. But when we put too many ornaments on the Christmas tree, what happens? The Christmas tree falls over, right? And nobody has Christmas and we're sad. So like we want to make sure that we're actually just kind of, you know, I hate to use it because it sounds like so conservative, like getting government out of the way, but it really is like we can't micromanage every single aspect of how a program, especially a program that's helping a living person, is going to work. Because the variable is that living person, right? So the less specific the program is to some degree, the more people it can serve, and like the more it can be easily executed and implemented and like have a greater chance of success.
I wonder about the notion of all the different government bodies that are there to enforce rules of the city, which are important rules, right? Rules exist because for fairness, for equity, for access, so that there can't be abuses or people taking advantage of the system. But have we gone so far in that direction that maybe we've forgotten, like, hey, if someone comes in and wants to start a small business in the city and, hey, wants to put their small business in downtown where we need a revitalization and is going to take up one of those abandoned storefronts and do something with it, we should be championing that person like, hey, come give me a high five. That's awesome. I'm coming on opening night to support you. Let me help you get through the things we have to do to make sure that it's done in the right, proper way. Do we need an attitude change, particularly in a time of crisis where we need growth and certain things to say like, you know what, in the city, we're champions for people doing things that improve the city. And right now, if you're going to create something or build something or start a business or grow something or do something that's going to impact our city, great job. We're your cheerleaders. Let us help you get through this process, as opposed to saying we're the enforcer of the rules and these are all the things you have to do. Otherwise, you can't do it. Do we need an attitude change?
I mean, I think the attitude you describe is certainly one that, you know, every city employee that is working kind of in that public facing role with directly with customers and residents and other stakeholders like that certainly should have that attitude. I would say there are many that do, right? There are many city agencies, city staff, individuals who are working in that way. And we've made some big improvements to help that. So if you go to the second floor of 49 South Van Ness, which is the new home of the planning department and the new home of our permit center, on that second floor, you'll find planning, the Department of Building Inspection, you'll find the Office of Small Business, you'll find other agencies that have a hand in, like, let's say you're opening a small business, a restaurant, which is like the most difficult from a permitting standpoint to open, because you've got to get the health department, you've got to get building, you've got to get planning, you've got to get these different agencies to approve your plans, to come inspect your actual physical location, sign off on everything, let alone all the other business planning that you've got to do. They're co-located now. Literally before, we used to have to tell people to like go a couple blocks away. Oh, you got this part now, but for your next form, you actually need to go to another part of the city because that agency is located over there. And not only does that help with customer service, but again, the attitude of like, hey, I'm so-and-so in planning, but you need to talk to so-and-so in this agency. Let me walk you over there. Or like when you get over there, I'm going to, let her know and understand what's happening. But certainly that can do attitude, that can help attitude. At the same time, we are the enforcers of the rule. We have to treat everybody fairly. But to your point is, how do we provide guidance? And there are cities that choose to provide more concierge service, where there are literally people whose role is to help people from soup to nuts, right? All the way through their permitting process. They don't work for any one agency. Instead, they are really guiding and shepherding people through and trying to unstick the log jams that can happen as people are navigating the city agencies.
And a metaphor that I would use to explain it is like recently I was in a new town. I went into the supermarket because I had to get, I have young children, had to get some baby diapers and other stuff that could not wait. And I'm saying like, okay, where do I find the diapers? And you go ask someone. And there's a couple ways. Like first person I asked was like, yeah, you go over to the back of the store and take a left over there and you can find it over here. And, we might be all out and like look down below, but if you want this, go over here. And then another person, because I got lost, and said, well, how do I find the baby diapers? And they actually like walk me, oh, let me show you. Yeah, it's a little bit confusing. We move the location. Let me go over here. There's this. And they just like showed me. And so what I wonder is, I'd love to do that everywhere in the city. But let's say we can't do that tomorrow, at least in these priority areas that so affect our future. And what would those might be? That might be like, okay, you're a person who is on verge of being homeless. You're right on that edge. And we know that one, if we can prevent you from being homeless, instead of you becoming homeless, your odds of success are much greater. It's a lot less expensive for the city. It's all of those things. So there's resources that people don't know for emergency funds so that you don't lose your apartment. And that would be an area where like, man, we ought to have amazing concierge service. What's another situation? I mean, someone who is on the streets now is actually at that moment, which is difficult to find, where they might want to get help which is a hard thing to do for a drug addiction. And like, now I've got to go to all these different agencies. Like if we could get that concierge service at that moment, maybe it is something like starting a business or a restaurant because everyone's trying to revitalize areas that have been hit hard like downtown. And maybe it's like, we're going to do it. So what do you think about that idea of almost like we've got to have these priority areas, these objectives where the city's interest is in making sure this person is successful. And we've got to ensure their success. And maybe if it's super complex, we have an auto like, in sort of private sector world, it's called a user flow. Have someone enter and like, okay, I want to accomplish this. What do I have to do? What are all the steps? Let's look at all the things they have to do from their perspective and then make it way simpler because we understand that, a lot of people that have to go to 14 offices are going to not make it all the way through.
Yeah. I mean, would you? I mean, I'm honestly shocked every day and so happy that people are opening small businesses in San Francisco because of the level of challenge, right, that it has. I think conceptually, I totally agree with you. Like, how do we get more of our service providers, whether it's that they're a city staff providing the service or a nonprofit, to be able to have like the knowledge, skills, and like the ability to provide that type of concierge level kind of direction to whether it's clients or whomever, so they can really kind of understand. Again, I think just to underscore, complexity can be good because you're addressing something very specific, right, with a specific, let's say, team or a specific niche, and it can help to address that problem really, really specifically. But then we get to the point where we have overly specialized, right? And then it's like, well, I know my thing, but I don't know about your thing. And therefore, if somebody is caught in between us, neither of us are really skilled in helping them. And so whether it's, some people have talked about, I even think about, okay, if I lost my job tomorrow and suddenly couldn't take my house payment, who would I call? Besides like friends and family and relatives, would I know who I would call if I was about to become homeless, but I could maybe not become homeless? And the fact that like, I don't know the answer, is it 311? Could they help me? But to your point, like some of these problems that we know we want to prevent or we want to like solve, how do we have something that's as simple as 911, right? We know when to call that, right? How do we have somebody, who do you call when you're really going through a crisis that can then help direct you to some resources that can help?
Well, and it was interesting because I think the Benioff Foundation had done some research into homelessness in California. And what they found is that a lot of people, just to use that example, didn't know all of the resources that were available to them. Like, oh, I didn't know there was a place that would help. I thought I was on my own, right? And you weren't. That's a shame because we actually did all the work to have the resources there. And it was purely a communication issue that prevented maybe a really bad outcome from happening, certainly for the person and the family, but also for the state, right? The state has a vested interest in that person getting to resources that prevent a lot worse condition. I want to move topics a little bit to talk because one of the things you do deal a lot with is the housing element specifically. That housing element is significant because it hadn't been updated since 2014. It was, kind of approved by the Board of Supervisors in January of this year. And one of the questions I have about it is our ladder up against the right wall in terms of all the goals and objectives we had? Because I just look at the document and it's organized in a series of goals. Goal 1, recognize the right to housing as a foundation for health and social and economic well-being. Goal 2, repair the harms of racial and ethnic discrimination against American Indian, Black, and other people of color. There's goal 3, foster racially and socially inclusive neighborhoods through equitable distribution and investment of growth. And it goes on from there. When I hear people and I talk about, specifically housing in San Francisco, what is the issue? It's like, we just need to create more housing, right? We have a housing shortage. That's the number one thing. And as a result, we have incredibly high housing costs. We just need to fix that across the board. I sort of expected to see that there. And there are some things, I didn't read the whole document. There are some things about especially affordable housing later on that gets reflected as a goal. But I expected to see we need to make more housing and increase the housing supply, a priority for the city. And I expected that to see number one. And maybe some of the other things mentioned there would be other things too, because we want to do it in the right way. But I didn't see that. Why is that? Was it missing? Is it just the nature of writing these things? I just felt like, this is just updated. It's going to be hot off the press. It's going to reflect the moment now. And everyone talks about we need to just streamline this process and get more housing and get more supply. Yet I didn't see that at all, really, at least in the goals of the housing element.
Well, we have a number of goals, right? So in the way that element is organized, there's goals, and then there's objectives, and there's actions. And so as you look deeper and deeper into them, there's 350 or 340 some actions that are called for in the housing element. So the goal is they're going to be the highest level of detail. And so you're going to see a lot of those actions relating to things that you talked about, production and streamlining. But again, it's not, I guess I would say, when we think about the challenges that we're faced for housing, they're myriad. They're not just one. Certainly supply. Supply is a huge challenge. We have underbuilt as a state for decades. San Francisco is no exception in terms of the amount of housing produced. It's been way too little. And in particular, this housing element cycle for all the regions across the country, or across the state rather, is asking folks to build significantly more housing than they've ever built, proportionally and numerically, in any previous housing element to address that supply issue. So I would say supply is built into the housing element as kind of just a general thing of what your element is going to do. It is going to increase the housing supply, period.
Hey, it's Ben Kaplan here. Want to join our movement to get San Francisco back on track? Attend a We Town Hall event or stop by our popular We Happy Hour meetups. Better yet, join our data team, take the census, or help us audit the city budget. To join the movement, text us at 415-301-6700. That's 415-301-6700. Or learn more at wesanfrancisco.org.
One other related thing, though, which you mentioned a little bit earlier, that also deals with how services are distributed in the city. And you mentioned community benefit districts, which are this public and private partnership. Essentially, there's residents of a certain neighborhood might agree to pay into an assessment of people who are in that neighborhood, and there's additional services that result in that area. The practical implication is, do you live in a community benefit district or do you not live in a community benefit district, you get a different commitment of services, because you might have cleanup that's done, once a week from the city, but that community benefit district puts additional services on top of that. So what do you think about this notion of community benefit districts, and ought we to have something that elevates a lot of the places that, if you're on this side of the street, but not this side of the street, then you're in one, you're not in one, then actually things get distributed, because it all came from a good place of, we want to be able to do more for our local neighborhoods. But does that actually, we need to lift everywhere up, because sometimes this community business district's going great and this other one's not going so well, this other neighborhood's not going so well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Planners love community benefit districts, which are also sometimes called community benefit districts if you look in local law or other cities. And so I think important part to remember them is that what happens is the landowners, or whoever the stakeholders are, vote to tax themselves to raise additional funds to provide those services, right? So it is not like they're just getting something extra. They are giving something extra. They're taxing themselves at a higher rate than folks who are not in that district in order to provide those services. And so I think, could it be good for everybody to have that level of service? Possibly. But, do they want to raise the level of service, the level of funds needed to provide that service? I think certainly one of the challenges we have that is limiting our community benefit districts is that they spend so much money on clean and safe streets. They can't do some of the other stuff that you'll see CBDs and other communities do, like hosting festivals and having fairs and promoting the local businesses and really having, let's do some art, let's do something extra, right? That's additional to just keeping the streets clean and making people feel safe. So I would love to see our city be able to handle keeping it clean and safe so that our CBDs can do the fun stuff, right? That's going to really make that, business district pop, so that, again, we can keep our small businesses alive and well and healthy. And then that benefits the neighborhoods as well. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but I do think maybe the last thing I'll say is unevenness of CBDs can be reflected in similar, are there too many? Are some of their boundaries too small? Could they consolidate, share resources better? So that instead of my CBD and your CBD that might be right next door, having two different cleaning staff or two different whatever, could we combine and collaborate and have some economies of scale, right? So then again, we have more resources to do the fun stuff, right? And do more collaborating together. I would love to see more of that happening.
And this notion of basic services that the city should provide, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree, but to me, clean or unclean streets and issues like property crime, too, have an oversized influence on how people feel about their city. And why? Because it's just evidence around you of disorder, civic disorder, how somehow the rules that we supposedly live by to be in a productive, creative, compassionate, innovative society that we all want to live in San Francisco, that we all believe in, is not working, is breaking down. Why? Because we can see it, because we're afraid to park a car on the street because we think it's going to get broken into. So somehow we have to elevate that, because that's going to make us feel like we're on the right trajectory. But to do it, and actually I know a ton of people in CBDs who do amazing work and good work, and I'm actually real fans and champions of the work, but it's I would love to see that everywhere. It shouldn't be you have to have a CBD or you're going to not be in good shape on your street. It shouldn't be a requirement, and it feels like sometimes it is.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think, and I will say I struggle with this question. I don't know the answer. Where did we get so off in the way that we treat each other in public and the way we treat our public space? Where did it become? I mean, certainly we can think about, and it's kind of easy to blame unhoused folks or people suffering from substance abuse. Certainly they can be rummaging through trash and leave it everywhere. Certainly I've seen a suitcase on the side of the road that's been filtered through, oh, I know someone's car got broken into and there are all the belongings been rifled through, and whoever got it just left it there on the side of the road. And so we see this disorder, and it's where's the source of it? But it's also the person walking their dog who doesn't pick up their dog's poo, right? Who has means, has the ability, but is just whatever. I was walking down the street the other day and there's this kid, well, he wasn't a kid, youngest man, probably my age, I don't know, just tagging on the buildings. And I actually looked back and I said, why are you doing that? He just shrugged his shoulders. Why are you just tagging people's buildings? What's the purpose of that? And so I think it's just trying to figure out, I struggle with why are people okay with treating our public streets, our shared spaces in this manner? And what will it take to stop it? Is it just cleaning it up more and people feel oh, it's clean, so I feel less empowered to litter, which is kind of a broken windows theory of things, keeping things looking nice makes people want to treat them like they're nice? Is it something deeper kind of in our social fabric and the way people have been socialized in San Francisco for what's tolerable and what's intolerable? I don't know. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Ben. I'd love to hear them.
Complex question, but I do think this notion of, hey, JFK's famous quote,
ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And if we're going to apply that to our city, right? Ask not what your city can do for you. Ask what you can do for your city. That's a tall order if you're going to do it alone. If you feel it's me against, it's okay, I'm, Rachel, no one else is doing it, but you're going to do it because you're just such a good person. We do have actually people in the city who do that, who are amazing people. But it's much easier if you're I'm doing this because my neighbor's doing this and other people are doing this and we're all coming together. So what I wonder is the solution to that not going to be necessarily an elected leader or a government official doing something? It's the community coming together, working together. And it starts with your neighbors, your friends, and coming together to do things. And really, we need a community movement to do this. And when you're part of something bigger than yourself, you're willing to commit more. And the ironic thing, though, is there's so many compassionate people who care about other people in San Francisco. There's people who want to do that. You just don't want to be the only one, right? You want to be part of a movement to this. So if we could all come together in some way, then I think a lot of people would be willing to do that. But we've got to figure out how to join hands and not feel like you're on your own. And the problem is when you're on a downward spiral, it can feel like you're on your own. It can feel like no one has your back. But we've got to come together. At least that's my opinion.
I think that's great. And I would even add more encouragement to say, I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule. So it doesn't even take that many people. It's going to be like 20% of the people who decide to make the change is going to impact the rest of the 80%, And so I think it doesn't take a lot of people to come together and say, like, we're going to keep this block clean, or, I'm going to do one little thing. What can I do? And if enough people are doing it, it doesn't even take that many to be enough. It really can kind of leverage things and change the tide of things.
And I even do one more better for you, because we, for some of my other work that I do in day job, when I'm not exploring issues of the city, is a 1% rule for bringing change in a population. So if you want like an idea to spread, it's often you need 1% of that population aligned. So in San Francisco, 800,000 plus people, 1% is 8,000 people. Imagine if we had 8,000 people, only 1% of the city, but like aligned and like, we're going to make a difference. We're going to clean this up. We're going to rally together. Like 8,000 people in San Francisco, a lot of the board of supervisor races, that's more than the total number of votes for a board of supervisor member, right? Like 8,000 people can have great impact. And if we could even align 1%, that would be a great start. And maybe if we align 1%, we get up to your 20% and maybe we sweep the whole city. So
Ben, what are we going to decide on? What are we going to rally around?
Let's work on it. Let's rally that together and let's do it. We'll brainstorm offline together. But Rachael, just to wrap up, totally appreciate all your thoughts. And maybe final thing is that given all your experience with city government, what are we not doing now or not talking about now? And maybe it's something in the corner of the government that no one sees. It's not the headlines in the Chronicle or the Standard or elsewhere. What should we be doing if you just had your way and could shine a spotlight on something that we're just not talking about? What would it be, given that you see all the nooks and crannies of how the government works?
I think we're not talking enough about accountability. I mean, granted, our budget is taking a hit this year in terms of our tax base. We had to make some budget cuts as a city, but like we spend a lot of money in the city on a lot of things. And I think we're not as focused. There's been a few headlines, some supervisors leading a charge, and like, what are we getting for our money? And really, again, how are we being accountable, whether it's through contracts, staffing, et cetera, to actually achieving the policy and like quality of life objectives that our budget reflects. Right? Our budget is a statement of our values, but for most of the things we do, it takes people to get it done. It takes a planner. It takes a person at the Rec and Park Department. It takes somebody in MTA. It takes a bus driver, right? Like there are actual individuals who are living out the values of our budget. And like, how do we have accountability of like, are those individuals, when they come together, achieving the outcomes that we've laid out? And if not, we got to ask why and see what adjustments we can make. So implementation is the long haul. It's not sexy. And accountability, nobody really likes it because you might have to be mean to somebody, but that's what it's going to take to really make sure that we have the things we want.
I would 100% agree with you. And I think that one of the things that accountability does, aside just getting the outcome on the actual task that you're being accountable for, is it builds trust. And it builds trust. And we absolutely need more trust now. We need more trust from residents to city officials. We need more trust from progressive faction to moderate faction, that we can work together. We need more trust that, if your car gets broken into, that people are going to follow up, that it's not just going to be lost or forgotten about. We need trust across the board. But usually trust forms because what is trust? Someone says they're going to do something and then they do it. And you're like, and then you have a track record. You're like, okay, I know Rachael said she's going to do this. She did it. Therefore, I trust Rachael to see this through. And if we all did that, then maybe we could come together more, and maybe there would be more work across the aisles and all of this kind of thing. So I 100% with you agree. And I think accountability pays off twice. Once on the initial task and twice because that trust we have. And if we have that trust, that's a great asset we could deploy to change the city.
And we can do more with that trust. If we have that trust, we can even go higher the next time we're working together. Absolutely agree.
According to Rachael Tanner, San Francisco needs more agile planning to deal with acute city problems. Issues like crime and safety, homelessness, and the fentanyl crisis. Only one problem: being lightning fast to respond to new challenges isn't typically how you describe San Francisco city government. But does it have to be this way? As Rachael points out, there's actually recent precedent for coming together with swift and speedy coordinated decision-making. That's exactly what happened during the COVID crisis. But why haven't we tackled other crises with this sense of urgency? As Rachael says, we need all hands on deck. We need to save our city now. In San Francisco, we needed our city leaders to use the bully pulpit instead of just bullying the other side, to get more alignment and consensus. So
Some of the greatest powers of the mayor, for instance, is the ability to shift priorities, change the narrative, and create laser-like focus for 39,000 city employees. Powers that aren't necessarily codified in any charter or law. So what if we scrapped the 8-year plan that takes 3 years to develop and instead developed a single, unified, and urgent plan for 2023 and 2024? What if instead of proposing a budget that's pretty much more of the same, we implemented some radical pragmatism? Radical because we need a dramatic change from a status quo that isn't working, and pragmatism because we can't afford making big expenditures with no results. What if we asked ourselves, what if, a little more frequently? Once we have that plan, Rachael says, it's all about accountability. Who is minding the store, and do we have such a person in every city department? Even a great plan gets poor results if we don't follow it all of the way through. I'm talking about contracts, staffing, clear outcomes. We've got to be A students in implementation. How many good ideas have miserably failed in San Francisco because what was supposed to cost $10,000 came in priced 10 times higher? So let's come together. We don't have to do it alone. We is always greater than me. I'm Ben Kaplan, and remember, we are San Francisco.
This amazing episode was brought to you by Top Thought Leader. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe.